Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martha McCoy, the Executive Director of Everyday Democracy, and to all of you, either here at the Hartford Public Library or online, welcome to the first hybrid Civic Ambassador Summit. And I just wanted to welcome you all, and before I introduce our co-sponsors to welcome you as well, I would like to start by acknowledging that the land on which we stand and gather today, our ancestral lands and territory of the Sukiok, Hokanam, and Wangung indigenous peoples who have lived and stewarded this land for many generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Please join me in a moment of silence to reflect on and honor their heritages and cultures. This is a good grounding for our coming together today to honor and respect human dignity and that we all have, and to honor each other in civic spaces, whether those civic spaces are physical or online spaces, as they often are these days. It's such an honor for me to be here. We have been working with the Secretary of the State's office on the Connecticut Civic Health Initiative for 11 years. And what sprang from that was the Civic Ambassadors Program. And you are here today because you are a Civic Ambassador, or you are online today because you are a Civic Ambassador. And I have to say that is one of the most honorific titles I can think of. I wear it proudly when I go in all my travels into shops, into the walkways of Connecticut these days. I wear my Civic Ambassador title proudly. So it's been an honor for us at Everyday Democracy to be part of this, and it's my honor right now to introduce from the Secretary of the State's office, Scott D. Bates, who is the Deputy Secretary of the State. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Martha, and it's great to be with all of you here today and virtually in Connecticut and who knows, around the world. You never know. I think it's important to mention that Martha has led this organization in one form or another for 30 years, and she will be moving on to new projects soon, but wow, what a great leader and modeler of what it is to be a leader that you are and have been for decades. And I hope that as you go forward, you think about the hundreds and the thousands of lives you've been able to touch and who have impacted you along the way. It's really remarkable. So thank you for strengthening our democracy in Connecticut. And you're right, civic ambassadors are people that care about the civic health of our community. And at a time when distrust in politics and government, which is the way we come together to take collective action quite often, at a time when that is really at a crisis point, this kind of gathering and the work of the civic ambassadors couldn't be more important. And today's focus on the equitable treatment of citizens and inclusion, that really is at the core of democracy. And I think when democracy doesn't function well, it's because equity is out of whack and people are not being included. That can be due to race, that can be due to income. We see it throughout our history, going back to the time of indigenous peoples and all the way through. And we're strongest when we're together. So it's great that all of you are focusing on these topics today. And you know, I think we know that change has to happen for our system to be vital and relevant to ourselves and to future generations. This is how you affect change, this kind of spring into action, because that's what you're doing. It would be very easy today to not tune in, to not show up, and to not be engaged. But you've made a choice, a proactive choice, and it's really pretty remarkable. Now, what my office does, where I'm privileged to work and have been for the last 5 years, Office of the Secretary of the State, we're about a lot of things, but one of the main things is voting. And that couldn't be more important in this system. It is the expression of how we can have a voice and we can impact the system. Under Secretary Merrill's leadership the last, about 12 years now, we've really been able to expand access to voting, and that's the next struggle here. At first it was to get the legal right to vote beyond, white property owners, which it was hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago. Now it's about access. Is it convenient to vote? And some people literally in the legislature before have said, well, it shouldn't be handed to you on a silver platter. It shouldn't be. Are you kidding? People have to work 1 or 2 jobs. They have to take care of their kids, and they don't need to be standing in a line for 15, 30 minutes, an hour. It's stunning to me that people do. But you know that in underserved communities, the resources aren't there quite often to make sure people are able to vote. Well, I could go on all day about that. I think the important thing is that the battle for voting rights is on now and across this country, and we need to view it that way. And I hope you as civic ambassadors view it, and when I say battle and use a war metaphor, I use it thinking this way. Go forward in strength and kindness, because that really will carry the day against any kind of force that has a small or blinkered view on what it means to be an American. So when we come together, we win. And thank you very much, and I'm so proud of everybody who's part of this program, and Martha, to you and your team, and to Val, I was going to say old friends, friends of long standing. You're not old. But what an honor it's been to work alongside you for the last several years, and congratulations to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for those remarks that were so inspiring, and also thank you for your kind words about my transition. And I have to say that the Civic Ambassadors Summit for the last few years, I get to go to a lot. Well, I used to get to go to a lot of places. I used to be on airplanes a lot, and I know some of that will resume soon. But one of my favorite events to attend each year was the Civic Ambassadors Summit, when we were packing this room on Saturdays, and the diversity of folks from across the state was just always so energizing. And race and ethnicity, towns, age. I remember one year, I think the youngest attendee was 9, and the oldest attendee was 78 or something like that. And people stayed all day long. And for me, there is nothing like the rush of taking the Civic Ambassador's oath, and I've taken it many times. Some of you may be taking it for the first time today, but it really is, for me, just an energizing thing to see, because it's often easy to think that what's happening in our country is that we're losing a sense of who we are and what democracy means and what we mean to each other. And when we are together like this, whether in person or virtually, I'm often reminded that there are people in every place who are working to bring people together in civic spaces that are addressing inequities and doing something about them, not just learning about each other and coming to understand each other and caring about one another as fellow residents, but also doing something about it. And so it's really exciting to see this. And Everyday Democracy, the organization I lead, is a national organization. So we work around the country and we support people in bringing communities together to actually address really critical issues like jail reform, like education inequities. And to do so these days is a much tougher thing than it was even 5 years ago. And so we really believe that democracy is what you can be doing with people who are around you every single day to make a difference in the way public institutions are accountable, and voting is such an important part of that everyday democracy way of life. So just I want to give a tiny bit of background on the initiative, but not long. But we started out 11 years ago to do a civic health report, which kind of had indicators. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor and they give you they issue your blood work and they tell you, here's how you're doing on this, you need to do this, you need to do that. You can listen or not, right, to what the doctor says. And we decided we wanted to do with the National Conference on Citizenship, which has been our national partner all along, and we decided we wanted to measure the civic health of Connecticut. But we always knew when we issued that first report in 2011 and again in 2016, we always knew that it wasn't just for the purpose of studying or getting that report and seeing how we compared against other states, that it was always something that would give us a roadmap for what we could do about it. And one of the things that we learned was that we needed to provide spaces in this state, which is very segregated, one of the most segregated states in our nation. In this state, which is very segregated, and where income inequality is great, and where racism, structural racism, really creates inequities across the state in terms of opportunities, in terms of outcomes, and in terms of civic opportunities. We knew that one of the things we needed to do was to provide civic spaces where people could come together who were working on these issues so that people could bring their energy together, because this is a wonderful state with a lot of great assets and a lot of great people who have a vision for the state that is one where there is inclusion, where there's justice, where there's voice for all. And to kind of say what Scott had said before is kind of like, when the state works for all of us, it'll work for all of us, right? And so we're in this together, and we are so pleased that you are here with us today. And just thanks to our sponsors. You can see on the board there really many, many sponsors, but I want to actually just thank Hartford Public Library for this space, which has been just a marvelous space today and over the years, and also our funder, Connecticut Humanities, and there are numerous sponsors that you'll see on the board up here. And so now I will turn it over to Bridget. Is it Bridget that I should turn it over to? Okay, I lost my script. Bridget Quinn Carey, who is the president and CEO of the Hartford Public Library. Thank you, Bridget.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Martha, and congratulations and good luck to you. You will definitely be missed. I want to say thank you for including me in the day's events. And Val probably know I say this every year. I say I can't think of a better place in which to have this summit, because a library represents that very thing, right? That very place, as well as the space through which we can come together. And one of the things that I like to think about the way libraries function, especially this library, is that we are creating those opportunities for democratizing access. And that is the philosophy, that's the premise through which we think about what we do, is making sure people have access, whether that's to information, to resources, to expertise, to facilities, to culture, to language. You really can put that lens on just about everything that we do. But one of the core pieces of that is making sure that we have the opportunity to talk to each other and become engaged in a civic dialogue. Because without that, we can vote, and voting is super, super, super important. And the library also helps to ensure that people know how to register to vote and provides access for them. In fact, we do citizenship ceremonies here, and we've had the Secretary of State here often, and both she and others talk about how important it is to vote, but not just to vote, but to be engaged and to learn how to do that. Because if that's not something you're familiar with, it can seem intimidating, it can seem a foreign thing or a closed network. But by coming together and meeting people and expanding your network, it enables people to become more active in their local government, in their city government, in their state government. And that's where change happens. Yes, voting is important, but change happens through grassroots efforts. And programs like this ensure that people know how to do that, right? And if it's not apparent how to become active, coming to a summit like this or becoming a civic ambassador helps you help others have a voice and then affect change in a positive way. And it's so much more than just saying, it's easy to throw stones, right? We see it on social media every day. Complaint, 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 complaint. And that's some people's comfort levels, but until you are ready to step forward and say, yes, here's a challenge, how are we going to address it, and what's that path? And knowing that there's another group of people out there that are thinking the same way and want to come together to help us all have strong communities, have a strong state, and be successful. So that's what the library is all about. We're so happy to host. As I said, it's the perfect place for this. I want to thank my team for doing this every year. We've got Nelson, who is our star, in the back supporting you today. And once you're done here, for those that are viewing online or that are here today, if you don't already have your library card, that's one gateway. So I make a little plug that if it's not at Hartford, go to your home library and get your library card and start using your library, not just for the materials, but also for all of the other opportunities you have to become engaged. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Martha and Scott and Bridget. Thanks so much. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today. A small group, but very powerful group. And those of you who are also on Zoom, thank you for participating. There will be another session tomorrow, so I invite all of you to participate on that virtual session as well. I am the Director of Strategic Alliances at Liberty Democracy and also the coordinator of the Connecticut Civic Ambassadors Program. I've been doing the program now since 2017, now 5 years. It's been really great working with this outstanding group of civic leaders. In the slides earlier today, it showed the demographics of the civic ambassadors. It's quite a dynamic, diverse group of people of all ages and ethnicities and races, and also geographic location. We have 142 civic ambassadors in 54 cities and towns throughout the state. Our goal is to have at least one civic ambassador in each of the 169 towns and cities in Connecticut. So we're getting there. We're about a third of the way. And every year we see more and more of them getting interested and participating in the summit and in the many different activities that we provide for the civic ambassadors year-round. So I also want to join Martha in thanking the sponsors of the summit, and you see them listed there in the screen. But of course, I want to again not only thank Everyday Democracy, which is an organization that I'm a part of, and the Secretary of the State's office, because we were the two initial partners in the Civic Health Project and working with the Civic Health Advisory Group, creating the Civic Ambassadors Program. So I also want to thank, of course, Connecticut Humanities, because they have always supported us over the years in sponsoring the summit, and this year is no exception. So thank you to Connecticut Humanities as well. I also want to thank the Kirwan Institute for the study of race and ethnicity at Ohio State University, and Kip Holley for traveling from Ohio to join us here today and represent that outstanding organization. The Kirwan Institute is one of our national partners we are proud to work with you in this important work that we're doing nationally. And I also want to thank, of course, the Hartford Public Library. They have always supported us. We've hosted the summits here for many, many years, I think from the very beginning, actually. So thank you again to the library, and also the other sponsors that are supporting sponsors that have participated in the planning of the summit. For example, the Connecticut Democracy Center, the Red, White, and Blue Schools with the Department of Education, Community Capacity Builders, the Connecticut Forum, Connecticut Kid Governor, Campus Compact, and the YWCA of Greater Hartford. They have all been a part of this planning effort to bring about the summit. Most of them have participated in the past as well, so thank all of them as well. I want to thank the members of the planning team. Some of them are here today. Elizabeth, Joseph is one of them, Matt Farley, Stephen Armstrong, Jamie Daniel, Antonia Edwards, and Valerie McVeigh. They are all the members of the planning team. They all serve in the Civic Health Advisory Group as well, so thank you, all of you as well. Now, one thing I want to mention is this event is part of the Stand Against Racism Day campaign. There are many organizations and community groups all over the country that are hosting Stand Against Racism Day events between now and Saturday. This happens everywhere in the United States, and we've been a proud partner of the YWCA to celebrate this campaign, and this event is part of that as well. Today's keynote speaker is Kip Holley. Will be contributing to the conversation about understanding how racism has impacted civic engagement. Right? We tend to think that civic engagement is us getting engaged to eliminate racism, but in fact, civic engagement itself has been affected by racism. So that is really at the crux of what he's going to talk about today. And he brings a lot of expertise on how to operationalize practices and ways of thinking and ways of working with each other to make sure that civic engagement is inclusive and that it incorporates practices of equity and justice. So Kip will be talking about a lot of the concepts in the humanities, and I mentioned that because the humanities is an important lens through which we learn about ourselves and where we came from and where we are and where we're going. And those disciplines are like history, for example, and poetry, literature, all the different disciplines that tell the story of who we are as humans, and here in this country, who we are as Americans. So it's important to know that's going to be the perspective also that we're going to use today. I also want to thank Jackie, who is our intern. She's done a fantastic job in the summit, and also want to thank the team at Every Democracy, Jennifer, Naisha as well, and Agnes. And but at this point, I do want to introduce our keynote speaker. Okay, I'm very, very proud to introduce someone who I very much admire and respect. I met him recently, very recently, but I am proud to say he's doing a fantastic job, and I'm proud to be associated with him. Mr. Dwight Kip Holley has been research associate at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity for over 8 years now, right, Kip? More or less. He's always strived to bring a greater understanding of how racial inequity plays a part in creating an environment in which we engage in public decision making. Kip has a bachelor's in science in city and regional planning and a master's in social work from Ohio State University. This multidisciplinary approach or background has helped to inform the intersectional lens through which he understands the civic engagement environment. Kip hopes that by gaining a greater understanding of how inequitable civic engagement practices often lead to inequitable policies and outcomes, community members are then better able to work together in new ways to develop new, more equitable policies that ensure everyone has an opportunity to succeed. Dwight is a very busy man. Year-round, he conducts research on topics related to the structures and processes that undergird civic engagement and public participation in decision-making, and also how they often produce racial outcomes. Kip shares accumulated knowledge about civic engagement equity with both academic and general audiences through the production of books, articles, and other media. He published in 2017 an outstanding research project and guide on how to operationalize practices for inclusive civic engagement. It is the work that is foundational to what he's going to talk about today. So I encourage you to read it. It's available in the Kirwan Institute website. Kip works with organizations to evaluate organizational structures using co-developed equity-based indicators, and he facilitates training sessions and workshops related to equitable civic engagement and cultural humility in organizational and community interactions. Outside of work, when he finds time, Kip is an avid creative writer, a frequent traveler, and he also enjoys woodworking and world cuisine. We have to talk about the woodworking because I love that too. So we'll get a chance to talk about it later. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished 2022 Connecticut Civic Ambassador Summit keynote speaker, Mr. Dwight Kip Holley. Dwight.
Well, thank you so much, Val, for a wonderful introduction, and thank you all for sparing some of your time out of this wonderful summit so that I could share some of our work and my work with Kirwan. And I just want to double check if I just the slides are just in there, right? Like I just kind of post them, or no? Okay. Okay. Sorry about that.
I think it's, yeah.
Oh, it's the next one.
Over here. Just one of those.
There we go.
That's it.
There we go. We're creating the rules as we go. That's what's fantastic, and that's what's fantastic about civic engagement. So it's right in action. I wanted to thank Val for a wonderful introduction. I want to thank everybody for inviting me, and thanks to all the speakers for wonderful introductions so far. I'm happy to be here sharing the space with everyone here who's here in person and who is here joining us from afar and remotely. Hopefully today, we'll get a chance not only for me to kind of share some of the work that I'm doing around civic engagement, but also for us to kind of share together some of our thoughts about how we can expand our ideals of who's involved in the civic and what is civicness and what is civic engagement and who does it work for. Because I think that those are the questions that kind of drag us and pull us into civic engagement so much. I also wanted to thank just specifically Val and Jackie for their work getting all this together with me. We've been working for about 6 months off and on, and for a lot of that, I think they probably thought that they were working with a ghost because I was really, really hard to reach. I say yes to too many things, and that means I'm pulled in a lot of directions, but they hung with me, and we got myself here, and I'm really, really happy to be here to share. One of the other things that also struck me as we were kind of walking in, Val and I were talking, and he said, you do a lot of trainings, and that's when I remembered I was coming to this keynote speaker without being a keynote speaker. What I am is a facilitator. So what you're probably going to get is 90% of a facilitator, but I'll try not to cheat you on any of the keynote stuff. I'll try to keep up with that a little bit and share that as well. Also, this is my first real public speech in a couple years since the pandemic, and so I think I'm probably a different speaker than I was since before the pandemic, and we're all going to figure out who that is today together. So once again, in a very civic engagement manner, we're going to build the rocket as we fly it, as one of my mentors said. But what I really want to be able to just share and talk about are our principles for equitable civic engagement at Kirwan, but really talk about that in recreating our civic identities through inclusive and equitable engagement now. We've been through some unprecedented changes over the last couple years in our communities, in the ways that we engage with each other in a civic way, in a community way, how we engage as neighbors, how we engage as citizens and residents. And then over the last decade, we've also been undergoing a lot of challenges. And it's a great time to stand back and think about what is a civic engagement now? When we say we have a civic identity, or we're acting civically, or we're residents or neighbors, or whatever words that we want to put behind that, what do we mean? And how is that relevant now in this new phase that we're in? So those are some of the topics I'm going to be talking about a little bit as we go along. And I'm also going to be spending a little bit of time kind of giving you a chance to kind of react to some of the things that we're talking about. It's going to be kind of like a hybrid facilitation. So generally what I'm going to be talking about is civic engagement in its place in our world as it is now, and how it has been in the past. We're going to be talking about this moment in civic identity, some of the challenges, some of the changes that are involved in that, and how we might be able to think about those in a different way. And we're going to talk about principled engagement, and specifically why, when Kirwan was thinking about or talking about equitable and inclusive civic engagement and how we can create that in our communities, we started with principles and what that's like. And then we're going to talk about how all of that kind of, works into the idea of creating what I like to call civicness, or an environment for people to know their civic identities and express those civic identities from their own experiences, and how all of this kind of rolls up into that. So I'll get there. Don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but we'll get there. And along the way, we'll be stopping for some interactive time, or some time to really stop or think and discuss. And we're going to be doing that through two basic sort of tools that we're going to use to do that. First, are going to be spaces for reflection. So every once in a while, in the midst of me kind of talking on and on and on and on, I will stop talking, and there will be a couple questions on the screen. And these are just questions that will allow us a short space of time to think about or discuss something we've heard. So if you're in person, this might be a place where you kind of stop and think about those questions, or if you want to talk about them with a neighbor over lunch, or however you want to do it, you can do that. If we are interacting remotely, you can maybe post something in chat, or say something, or just think about it to yourself too. There's no requirements on these reflections to engage in a particular way. These are just places for us to stop and think about some of the things that we're hearing and talking and learning about. And the second way we're going to be doing is through a series of activities a little bit later in my talk, where these are more specific activities and invitations to discuss and learn about some of the things that we're going to be talking about as well. I talk a lot in concepts, and so knowing that I'm talking a lot in concepts, I want to try to make it as real to people as possible and get it out of that sort of airy academic space and into our everyday lives. And so that's what we're going to be generally doing. And once again, these are going to be small group discussions that we can interact with in whatever way works for us. So, I think here and online, people will be broken down into small groups, and some people can talk a lot, some people can listen a lot, some people can, take notes or facilitate or interact in chat, however you want to do it. These are just spaces for us to be able to kind of sit back for a little longer time and kind of discuss with each other what's important about civic engagement, what's important about equity and inclusion in those conversations, and kind of react together to what we've been hearing, because that's what civic engagement is, right? It's about us kind of reacting and acting and learning together. And so I figured I'd practice a little bit, or try to practice a little bit in this forum where I'm going to be dominating the conversation a little bit. So with that out of the way, I like to start with this slide because I think this is the truest thing about civic engagement in America. And it's the ideal that kind of led me to my lifelong sort of obsession with civic engagement and community engagement, is that community engagement is everywhere. I think in a lot of places around the world, and maybe even in a lot of places that we think of, people think about civic engagement as just voting or public meetings or maybe a newspaper, and it's that as well. But, you know, in America, civic engagement can happen anywhere, and it can happen in a lot of different ways. It can be a volunteer activity that we're doing. It could be a design charrette where people are sticking stickers on a map or something like that to talk about their community. It could be a community cleanup. It can be a community dinner. It can happen on front porch. Some of the best civic engagement, community engagement activities, oh my God, have happened on people's front porches, eating some good food and talking about, having some real talk about struggles and challenges and solutions that we can all come together. And I think that's the magic of civic engagement in the way that we think about it, is that it really can happen anywhere. It's not like business communication where you have to get up dressed up in a suit like this and use jargon and, you know, somebody's going to get paid and somebody's not going to get paid at the end of it or something like that. Civic engagement can be something like that, but it can also be, you know, we're sitting around in shorts and t-shirts, you know, watching our children and talking about like what we could do about the community. Happens all the time. It can happen with officials. It can happen without officials. It can happen at any time of the day or night. You know, kind of to paraphrase, when, you know, two or more people, community areas get together, you've got community engagement. And I think that's what we all want out of community engagement too. We want it to have that kind of magic where you can get together with somebody that maybe you don't share everything with, like your family, but you can come together and find some common understanding to make change in your community. And really, that ideal kind of is popularized by Alexis de Tocqueville in his text, Democracy in America. This is where people kind of think about it. When you think about it historically, and you think about civic engagement in America, most people, Tocqueville is the first person that you come up with. And Alexis de Tocqueville had challenges, especially by today's standards of what we think about statements. But in this particular form, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America and his reaction and his noticing of America's sort of voluntary associations amongst that could happen amongst any type of people and could be associated, could be formed around anything, is really the kind of thing that America kind of based our ideal of what civic engagement in America is and how it's different. You know, in 1831, when de Tocqueville came to America, he actually, funny enough, came to America to study American prisons. He was sort of commissioned to do that by King Philippe of France. And he and his partner said, we don't want to do that. We want to study American life. And so they did what they had to do with the prisons, which was also a good, fantastic report. But they quickly went out, and he was looking at democracy in America, and he was taken by these voluntary associations. And it's funny because even if he had visited America 10 years before, he may have come away with a different idea of what civic engagement looked like. Voluntary associations and sort of this democratized civic engagement was still fairly new. You know, we were still maybe 10 years away from not being able to vote if you didn't own property. You know, that was still really new. The first election where you could vote regardless of property, owning property as a white male, of course, was in 1828, just 3 years before he had come. And when he came, he kind of, in his Democracy in America text, he talked a lot about the role of these sort of voluntary associations, that people coming together in these sort of informal ways really benefited and defined the character of American democracy and was a new way of being able to come together to solve problems. It wasn't left up to rich landowners or magistrates or to royalty to do that. This was really government for the people, by the people, with a lot of caveats on that, of course. But that was his thought, and that was the thought that Americans kind of carried on with us throughout that time period, is that, yes, American democracy is this place where people can come together in these informal ways and create society in that way. And it was very exciting. And to this day, I think de Tocqueville's ideal is what we want from democracy, is that kind of magic of being able to make decisions with our neighbors and come together, even if we don't have a lot of expertise, to make public decisions. And it really informs Kirwan's ideal of civic engagement and our definition of civic engagement, which we made because, of course, there are a lot of definitions of civic engagement, and we just had to add our own because you got to. Our definition of civic engagement, though, is a little different. We were looking at a lot of definitions, and it didn't match what we were seeing when we were working with communities and we were looking at some of the literature. And so we kind of took a holistic view, and we said, maybe civic engagement is sort of the sum total of the practices, principles, and socioeconomic conditions that comprise the environment in which people engage. So whatever sort of practices people are engaging, wherever you're engaging, whatever your social situation, and whatever the motivations are for engagement in your community is civic engagement to you. It is the environment in which we are coming together as community members, as people who are working for the state, people who are working privately, and community citizens to come together and make and implement community decisions. So it's really kind of this holistic vision, right, of how these kind of different aspects of an ecology. You can think of it as like one of those ecology paintings with like the clouds and the rain and the grass. And that's kind of how we think about it, is that all of these kind of things are elements of an ecology, and you put them together and you come up with a civic engagement environment, an environment for making public decisions that has certain characteristics. And what we said when we were talking about equity is that it's these conditions that play the part in whether community engagement is equitable, where everybody has a seat at the table and where everybody's voice is relevant, depending on sort of the collision of these three ideals. And so really, going away from thinking about civic engagement is X or Y, thinking about civic engagement can be a lot of things, just like we were talking about before. And depending on how those things are kind of situated, people either have more or less of a chance to have a voice in engagement. And, this kind of undergirds, the other part of that equation, that civic engagement is everywhere, but also that civic engagement is key to so many things in our lives, pretty much everything's in our lives. Public investments, of course, but also, things like sort of housing access and housing prices, or school access, or, freedom from pollution and toxins, especially in our environment where environmental justice and environmental racism is becoming a bigger issue. How people are able to engage in that, not just through voting, but also through protests, through voluntary associations, through getting involved in boards, through volunteerism. Civic engagement ends up being key to all of these things and the policies that drive these different aspects of our society. But we don't really think about it that much. We think about the policy and goals, or maybe we think about how much money should be put in to the work of forwarding policies. But often, civic engagement plays this hidden part. And who's able to engage and how they're able to engage plays a big part in the policy outcomes that we end up with. And so I'm going to stop there for one of our first space of reflection. And I want us to reflect on a couple of questions now that we've kind of seen this. First, how does this framing of civic engagement as a connected ecosystem change your ideals of engaging with community? And then what sort of activities do we sometimes not see as engagement? So, thinking about that holistic system and all those pictures, are there any things that you can think of that are engagement that aren't seen as engagement? And, how does this kind of change your ideal, framing it as an ecosystem, change your idea of engagement? And so, as we said, if you are joining remotely, you can post something in chat if you'd like to. Or you can just kind of think about it. And here, if you can talk about it with a neighbor for the next couple of minutes, or you can just kind of think about that as well. So we will take a couple of minutes and just kind of give ourselves a chance to think about it. Well, I hope, I never know how these reflection sections are going to go. I've done these sometimes and it's just 2 minutes of silence, and I've done these sometimes and people are like looking at me angrily like this should have been 5 minutes. And so my apologies on either one of those, and feel free to keep thinking about this, and there'll be space to talk about this, to talk later on. And if you want to, continue these conversations, feel free and continue them through the summit. That's the general ideal, is not to really feel like we have to have the entire conversation now, but to kind of seed it. And, as we're making our way through the summit, or even after the summit, we're like, I want to revisit that conversation like later, because that's me. Like at the time, I never have anything to say. Like on a question like this, I would probably just be sitting there listening for like until the last 30 seconds, and I'm like, oh wait, and then it's over, and then it's like midnight, and I'm like, I still want to talk about that. And you can't bother people at midnight like that, because they won't like it and nobody wants to talk to you. So if you're like me and you have more thoughts later, feel free to continue to circle back to these too. But I wanted to kind of continue and talk about some of the challenges. And I think the challenges kind of start where we left off. That civic engagement plays such a huge part in how we create our policies, because voluntary civic engagement is such a huge part of civic engagement in America, that civic engagement then gets a chance to be more powerful. It's not as regulated. Anybody can be involved. And of course, where there's power to make decisions, there will be conflict, particularly when you factor in existing social inequities. And so the history of civic engagement in America has been marked by sort of this twin ideals of people fighting to gain a seat at that table, right? And people fighting to keep people out of the table. And, you can talk about things like the 15th and 14th Amendment providing the vote to black men, to the suffrage movement to provide voting for women, and later movements to provide voting rights to people under the age of 21. And of course, when de Tocqueville was talking about this, America in the midst of providing benefits to white men who didn't have property. All of these are sort of examples of people sort of fighting to gain more of a voice in the public policies that affected their lives. And they really kind of expanded this idea of voluntary associations and their importance in this sort of informal engagement and its importance in making policies, but also sort of intensified efforts to keep people away from that. So especially as we move on past the Civil War and into the Reconstruction era, black codes were used to not only keep black people from voting, but also keep black people from associating. And that was also accompanied by decades and decades of violence against black communities, not for not only economic reasons, but kind of hidden among that were, associating. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other sort of white supremacist groups that were raiding largely keep black people from associating in things like the union leagues and other meetings where they could meet about political action. That was almost always one of the major sort of start-off points for groups like that to engage in violence in black communities at that time. Also at this time and then afterwards, many officials from the government, many white officials had laws banning indigenous gatherings and culture exchanges from things like different tribal gatherings and things like that, where people could come together as well. Attacks on women's suffrage meetings. It's not really talked about, but like women suffrage groups had an entire martial art, which I can't remember the name of right now, but I learned about this recently, largely because they had to ward off attacks from people who were attacking meetings and attacking protests because they wanted to stop women from meeting to try to get the vote. segregation laws kind of continued with black codes, and then added things like poll taxes and other types of regulations to keep people from voting. Stonewall, that Stonewall happened at a gathering place for LGBTQ people in our communities. And of course, now you see, a greater criminalization of protest, or whether it be in laws or in a lot of the rhetoric that people are using around things like Black Lives Matter and protests related to income inequality. And so you have this sort of, people realize with the nature of civic engagement, the open nature of it has the potential to give you and I power over the public policy that affects us in a lot of ways, no matter what our background, no matter what our color, no matter what our social identities. But the people who are in power are often looking to restrict that for that reason, because the more people who are at the table, the less chance you can sort of control which public policies are in demand, and that's been sort of a historical thing. And I point out this is one of my favorite things to study from history, is the Black Convention or Colored Convention movement in the 19th century, in the later half of the 19th century. And it doesn't really get as much credit as it should for sort of like exploding the convention movement in America. So conventions like this, where you had people maybe from an entire state getting together to talk about a policy, people had those in America and even in the UK. But they really found their footing in 19th century America, and they really found their footing amongst women's suffrage and black rights advocates and abolitionists. A lot of the early abolitionists were meeting in conventions. Of course, the Seneca Falls Convention that started off our conception of the modern women's suffrage movement in America was an anti-slavery convention originally. And these are conventions that happened specifically after the end of the Civil War, were the opportunity for black citizens to come together in a different ways, not only to find community, but in a way that provided the necessary space for black people to enter into and have an effect on popular politics. These conventions gave rise to many of the early black politicians that existed in the 19th century. Frederick Douglass spoke at most of these as well. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, all of these kind of conventions proliferated in the early Reconstruction era as more and more black people realized that their freedom was not necessarily guaranteed by the 13th or 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment, that political action was needed to secure their rights and their homes and their families and secure themselves against violence. And so there was just an intense level of these conventions, from South Carolina to Kansas to other places out west. And also women were having these conventions as well around suffrage as the suffrage movement took off. And so a lot of those conventions played a huge part in just the sheer number of conventions and also societies and other voluntary associations that existed around that time. And so when we think back to our history about this sort of voluntary movement and engagement, and a lot of people think about conventions, maybe, in the dusty parts of our mind, like, yeah, that happened, there are people in suits, it's lots of banners. We don't usually put black faces to that. We usually don't put faces of color. We don't put women in the center of that, but they very much were a part of that way of engaging, and that sets up the way that we engage today. And it was largely based around recognition that their ability to associate together and their ability to play a part in public policy was under attack, and they needed to secure it through the use of association and civic engagement. And so sort of these challenges around access to civic engagement exist today, but I think they really point to the sort of paradoxical nature of our civic engagement space in America, and the way we think of it is that, these voluntary associations are a means to come together. And when we first think about it, and we think about it in that sort of all shucks way, we think about it. It's like, yeah, voluntary association of neighborhood dog walkers, sounds great. Or a voluntary association of people who like chocolate and strawberry ice cream or something like that. These are different ways of people to find commonality. And it definitely is that. But it is also a means to gather and exercise for public decision making. The entire civil rights movement was a long series and chains of voluntary associations, whether they be faith-based or political-based or social-based, coming together with the overall mission of fighting segregation and securing more freedom for all. For African Americans and for people of color in general. It's really kind of paradoxical in that way, and it still remains paradoxical that way. And so we carry the weight of that history of exclusion and fighting for inclusion with us today. But we also add a few more challenges that exist today that didn't necessarily exist in the past, that are a challenge to our conceptualization of civic engagement and understanding civic engagement, what it is now, and how it can be inclusive of everybody. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about these. I'm just going to kind of drop these a little bit. But I think that these are some of the challenges that, when I'm talking with other practitioners today, we talk about a lot. And first is this fuzzy definition of civic. Over the last 40 years, America, for better or for worse, has been engaged in an experiment in changing the role of government in our lives. It's very different than it was in, say, 1970 or 1960. And so, the civic space is difficult to define. It's difficult to define what is a civic space in public nowadays. There are a lot of public-private spaces. Civic space is difficult to think about in our online age. I mean, the dominant conversation probably going on in most of our communities right now over the last week is Elon Musk buying Twitter, and what does that mean for public decision-making? And the fact is that this is a private company. But it has become sort of a de facto public space because how people are engaging as neighbors, as citizens, it is bleeded into sort of business, it's bleeded into the private in ways that none of us could have really thought about. Growing diversity and globalization. Our communities are more diverse, and our communications and our community making is more global. Our communities are no longer just the people on our block, but it could be, the Reddit group that I'm a part of related to black cats, which I really am. And that might be a place where I'm sharing a lot of commonality. But also, yes, our communities are more diverse. And so instead of just being able to engage with people who have the same point of view as I do, many people are engaging now with people from different points of view. And unfortunately, our society really hasn't set us up to do that, to learn the skills to do that. We can do that, and civic engagement can be a part of it, but it's definitely part of the landscape we're looking at. The dawning of the social media age, which I alluded to before. I teach a class in civic engagement at OSU, and my students talk about this all the time, is that, Professor Holley, most of the stuff you're talking about is like 20 years old, because none of it is talking about the ways that we engage on Twitter or through Instagram or through TikTok. And it's easy to sort of overlook that or talk about that in a joking way, but not only young people, but we're all engaging on these platforms in different ways, and that's part of our civic life in a way that it hasn't been, and we're still learning how to get our arms around that, or what that means. What does civility mean in that part? What does civicness mean in that part? How do we act honestly in that part? And there's a lot of information and disinformation that kind of comes with this new social media age, and how do we navigate that when we're talking about the problems that we share in common? Increased inequality, which goes without saying, in terms of wealth inequality, income inequality, living inequality, housing crises in terms of that. all along the lines of racial and social identities in many ways. And in many ways that we wouldn't have expected. And so being able to navigate, a lot of that intersectionality, right, a lot of those intersectional identities and the spaces that people find themselves in because of structural inequalities is another part of civic engagement that we cannot ignore. And all this kind of speaks to relevancy. With all these changes, there's a larger, bigger voice amongst many people who have been left out of civic engagement or who find themselves disempowered by a lot of these factors to say, why is this even relevant? What is civic engagement and why should I be involved in it? And that's different. For most of the history of our country, civic engagement is something you had to engage in one way or another if you were going to, play a part in your community. And now there's a lot of different ways that people engage that are kind of quasi-civic, maybe private. And now when we're, inviting people to engage in civic discourse and dialogue, and we're asking people to give their time and their energy, they rightfully are asking, like, why? What's it for? What's the gain out of it? Why should I be compelled to do that? And there are great reasons for it, but I think we as practitioners, more than maybe a couple generations back, need to be ready to answer that question up front, rather than sort of assuming that everybody, has to be here because they have to be here. And so, just going and hitting on the social inequalities and who might be left out. Often it's people of color, people who are poor, and people who are otherwise marginalized by social inequities. I'm just going to talk about some of the studies that I talk about with my students. A bipartisan policy center study showed that precincts with large minority populations were more likely to experience longer wait times and polling place closures. This is probably nothing that you probably haven't heard before, but I want to just kind of put the point there. Another study found that only 48% of the lowest income bracket voted in the 2016 presidential election, where 86% of the highest bracket voted, largely due to challenges and barriers getting to the polls and being able to have the opportunity to vote. And of course, resources and skills and particularly important dominant forms of activity. Many of the studies will talk about how being able to find and have and be able to be taught and learn civic skills plays a big important part in how confident people are in coming to engagement and therefore how much they're going to do it. And unfortunately, that education is usually locked behind paywalls of some sort. It is very much skewed towards people of middle and higher incomes and whiter Americans. And so as an effect, people of color, people of lower incomes are less likely to feel comfortable and therefore engage in our communities. So these social inequalities sort of impact our engagement, just like Val was talking about. The end effect is that our civic engagement is therefore inequitable as well. And so when we're talking about engaging with people, we have to engage this idea of these inequities. We cannot ignore them. We cannot, sort of brush them off. They have to be part of how we think about how we're going to engage and what we're going to be engaging about to be relevant. And so, all of this kind of leads to a legitimacy crisis in civic engagement that I think we are all feeling now. Over the last couple years, I know myself, I've kind of felt that the ideal of civic engagement is not necessarily under attack. I don't want to put it that way, but more, in question. It's more of an open question about not only, is civic engagement relevant, but how do we legitimize civic engagement, and who is it legitimate for? So, just talking about some more statistics, in terms of voting, for instance, 32% of the population still believe that Biden won the presidency through fraud. And in terms of protest, there was a study by Nature magazine that talked about the fact that when focusing on protests, headlines were 4 times more likely to talk about violence and disruption at the protest rather than the what the protest was about. So about like police violence in this particular case. And so, a lot of the conversation around protests was not about, fixing challenges in America, but like why this protest is or isn't legitimate in one way or another. And of course, as we probably all know, America's been going through a long-term, dwindling trust in civic institutions that has sort of intensified over the past 10 years as these civic questions have come more to the fore. And so, the end of this is that sort of our overall inability or challenge in dealing with that duality of our voluntary associations, both as a place to gather, but also as a place of political power, mixed with the endemic internalized racism and social inequities that have existed in our country since the beginning, added to by a lot of the problems that we're seeing over the last 40 to 20 years in terms of how people are thinking about civic engagement. It's kind of led us to a legitimacy crisis of sorts about where people are asking, why is civic engagement relevant? What's legitimate civic engagement? What does it mean to me? And I don't necessarily think it's bad that we're asking this question. I think it's necessary that we're asking these questions because these changes have happened. The history that we've gone through has happened, and the only thing that can happen by us, trying to put a pretty face on it and ignore it is that we are stuck with these problems until civic engagement becomes completely irrelevant. So now is the time for us as practitioners to use our practicing to answer these questions or give people the space to come to those answers with one another. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but really I just wanted to drive that point home a little bit. And so with reflection, I'll give 3 minutes this time because everybody looked like they were ready to go, and I gave more, so we'll go with 3. Two questions about that. First, have you noticed any of these issues playing out in the engagement activities that you've been a part of? And then what might keep people from clearly seeing these challenges related to power and different assumptions about people and civic engagement that may lead to challenges related to inclusion and relevancy? So those 2 questions, feel free to take 3 minutes, think about those, talk about there with a neighbor, post something in chat, and we'll come back. All right. So we'll come back together and, talk a little bit more about this. I hate to break up such great conversations. I feel like I'm betraying civic engagement when I do this, but, I'm contractually obligated. I feel like kind of like a bingo caller up here as well. It's like I feel like I could yell out like B8 and that somebody would yell bingo. I don't know. I hope that everybody had a really good conversation here in person. It looks like everybody really had some really great thoughts, and like I said, feel free to keep talking about that as it goes on. I'll move on to talk about kind of what now, right? I think that what I shared probably isn't really that surprising to anybody around here, right? I think we all even if we don't know some of the facts, we all kind of felt some of those things, that some of these things are challenges to civic engagement. When we look at what happened at the Capitol on January 6th of last year, I felt like this was the result of some things that I, as a practitioner, had not really looked at, and that maybe some of my fellow practitioners had not looked at about the ways that people were seeing or not seeing themselves in civic engagement and seeing their civic identities. And so I think, it kind of leaves us with this question of like, okay, if civic engagement doesn't mean what it used to mean, what does it mean? And, like all good civic engagement practitioners, the first thing we want to do is come up with a definition. Like, what is it? It's got to be something. And it's like, well, civic engagement is this or that. Like, I've heard different people say, like, civic engagement isn't online engagement, or civic engagement, it's something that happens in person, or civic engagement is something that's more regimented, or civic engagement involves, like, only people who are acting the right way, or civic engagement is only happening if it leads to direct action. And none of those seems to hold everything. Any definition that we try to come up with doesn't really hold anything, and it doesn't really get us any closer to understanding some of those challenges and how we can get a hold of all of those different challenges that we talked about and all those different characteristics in a different way. And so, like, we go and I go, to these definitions, which are also part of that holding. It's not that these are not part of the definition, but like, think of it as civic or philanthropy, or it's newspapers, or it's not newspapers anymore because newspapers are owned by conglomerates or governance and things like that. And when we were starting to think about equitable civic engagement, we were coming at it from a little bit of a different way, but like, we were kind of tripping over these ways of thinking about civic engagement that were very discrete. And finding communities that were engaging in different ways. Like, every time we would try to define it a certain way or come up with best practices, there'd be like a community that was doing something completely different, or that had completely different situations that they were dealing with where it wasn't going to work. And so, we kind of gave up on thinking about sort of definitions, and we were in the midst of thinking about best practices that weren't working, and then we were like, well, wait a minute. Some of these best practices have some things in common. And what are those things in common? And we started to think beyond practices and started to think about principles. And it's like, all right, we're looking for equitable civic engagement. We've seen some practice and some people come with moments of genius and brilliance in different communities and making it on their own, some things in academia. What's the root of what makes this work? And we kind of started looking at that. We started to look at, like, what is the organizing principle or motivation that's making this practice work for equity and inclusion? And what are the ones that don't? And, that kind of led us towards our 6 principles for equitable civic engagement. And these are kind of like sort of the underlying sort of principles or motivations or thrust behind a lot of the action on civic engagement and a lot of the practices that we have seen that have widened that table for engagement, that have widened that table for relevancy and delivered more civic power for people and help people develop civic identity under their own terms. And so for the next half of this, I'm going to be talking primarily about these principles and a little bit about how they sort of connect with this idea of equity, and maybe talk about some of the challenges that we've been talking about before. But those are the embracing the gifts of diversity, recognizing the role of race, power, and injustice, practicing rallying call hospitality through inviting and listening, which I'll talk about, trust building through commitment, honoring dissent and embracing protest, and practicing adaptability to change. And those were the 6 that we really found that seemed to be showing up again and again and again in those practices. And the reason that, like, we really liked principles is that, like, instead of being like a check the box or something, especially when we're talking with organizations that engage with communities and practitioners who are like, just tell me what to do. And we tried telling people what to do, and it's like, well, that didn't work in our community. It kind of got us beyond that conversation and started to think about what is it that we want our civic engagement to achieve? What is it that when we go home at night and we say this civic engagement was successful in bringing people together and bringing more people to the table and being equitable and giving people an equitable voice, what does that mean? And that's what these principles kind of point us to, pointing us beyond thinking like just a hunt for practices, and starts us off in a question about what it is it that we're here to do when we're saying we're going to engage civically. What is it that we're promising people when we're facilitating civic engagement? And then moving from that and talking about then what are the practices or ideals or things that we want to follow that might help us achieve that a little bit. But that's all pretty heady. And so in this next part of the conversation, I apologize, is going to be more conceptual. Before we have a conceptual conversation, I felt like it would probably do us all good to think about these principles in a more concrete and personal way. And so that's what this first activity is going to be about. It's talking about transformative change, really, but it's really about telling stories about some of these principles. So in this activity, you got 6 different prompts for a story. Everything from tell me a story about the time when you felt that your talents were appreciated, that you could sense who had power in a group, that somebody made you feel like you belonged, that you were trusted to share responsibility, that it was okay for you to say no to someone in authority, or that you were free to go through a difficult change at your own pace. And what we're going to do is we're going to get into our groups, and I want one person to tell a story. It doesn't have to be a long story. It could be an anecdote. It could even be an example. Like it could be like a haiku if you really wanted it to be. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out story. Just think about each of these questions and think back to your life about a time when one of these things happened to you or somebody that you know, and how it made you feel, and really tell that story. And then what I want is for everybody else in the group to kind of react to that story. You can react to it by sharing a story of your own, or just comment on what you've heard, or maybe it'll make you think of another story that you might have heard, or some other thing that you want to talk about. I have no caps on that. I just want everybody to kind of think about these questions in their lives rather than discrete concepts like, how does it feel to have these practices practiced upon you, or to practice them with others? And so what we're going to do is we're going to take 10 minutes and get into our groups, and we're going to do that. And then we'll come out and I'll continue on. You don't have to report out to me. This is not for me. This is for you and for everybody to share. If somebody wants to share something towards the end, let's feel free. But this is really just for us. So take 10 minutes, and we're going to get into groups and do that kind of share. All right. We'll continue on here. It sounds like there was a lot of story sharing, which is always wonderful. In civic engagement, love that. I think that's the cornerstone of what we do. So I'm not surprised that a lot of people were really good at doing it. I guess, coming out of this exercise, like I talked about before, I don't want anybody to feel like they need to tell me what you talked about. What I really want everybody to do is to kind of think about what you heard in your stories, and think about the stories you told, and think about those as we start talking about a lot of these principles, because I'm sure some of these same things will continue to come up a little bit, but I really think that it starts with thinking about how does this affect us personally, and then how do we want to bring those feelings into our engagement? How do we want to express those? What tools, what practices, what information do we need to know to be able to give other people, or help other people find anyway, those same experiences as well? And in that way, principles, really start us off in these questions, these very, really often difficult to answer questions. People often want me to answer the questions as well, and I'm like, I don't know, I don't live in your community. I may have some ideals, but you also have some ideals, and other people have ideals. Maybe people we don't talk to have ideals, but first we have to ask the right questions. One of my favorite civic engagement practitioners and thinkers is Peter Block, and he talks a lot about civic engagement being about the questions that we ask each other, not about the answers so much, but about the questions that we come together to ask and that we're willing to ask ourselves, and I think that we're willing to grapple with. And that's I think the magic of principles is they ask us to grapple with principles that then force us to widen the scope about what we think is engagement or engagement practice or engagement gatherings in ways. And then that reflects another question about how comfortable am I with that? How uncomfortable am I with that? And what needs to happen in order for me to change? And so principles really start this domino of questions that I think lead to a widening of the civic engagement space. And so now I'm going to talk about some of these principles in a conceptual way and kind of the questions that they call on us to answer really quickly. There's a lot of information on the slides. Feel free to partake in that while I'm talking, because I'm going to be going through them kind of quickly, and we'll have another activity in the midst of it. But I just want to really start us off in talking about these principles and why we think they're important at Kirwan. So the first one we talk about is embracing the gifts of diversity and expanding our ideals of what gifts, which means skills, abilities, leadership, civic leadership, all of these kind of things. How can we honor these gifts that people are bringing, and how can we expand our own ideals of what gifts, skills, and abilities are? No matter how well-meaning we are, we're all coming from a point of view, which means we can't possibly know all the skills and gifts and abilities that community members can bring. And so often a civic engagement opportunity is us as facilitators and leaders to learn about ourselves and about community members in different ways. I always say I learn 4 or 5 times as much as I give when I am in communities. And a lot of it is about what people have to bring. The picture you're looking at right now was the first group of Neighborhood Leadership Academy that was started by a local organization, Community Development and Church for All People, along with United Way, and Kirwan was lucky enough to be involved in building some of the curriculum for that. But all of these leaders are people who have never been asked or felt that they would never be asked to be leaders. Some of them have PhDs, some of them did not finish high school, some of them have a lot of money, some of them don't have a lot of money. Some people are coming from really hard circumstances, some people not. People are coming from different religious traditions. But what we had to do is we had to sort of change our way of thinking about how to look for leadership skills. We were coming from a very academic, very business ways of looking at it, and we had to think about different ways to look for skills, different conversations to have, different things that we had to do internally with ourselves and our organizations to be able to find the gifts. And I'm so proud. This is the first of, I think at this point, 7 or 8 classes of leaders that have come through that process. And it really started with us realizing that we didn't know what all the gifts in the community were, and then asking ourselves how we could recognize those. And so I'm going to break us up a little bit with the second activity, and then I'll talk about the rest of the principles. But I think this activity is central because I'm going to go back to this a little bit as I talk about the other principles. And this is about identifying gifts. And so we're going to get into groups again for another 10 minutes. And this time, I want us to think about how community leadership can come from these different types of people that a society usually tells us don't have anything to offer. And I picked 3 groups in general, but you could probably think of your own, and if you're in conversation and you want to think of a group or a group of people that's closer to you, feel free to substitute one of these. But just to get us started, I want us to think about the leadership skills and abilities and qualities in leadership that could be found amongst 3 different groups of people. First are young people in a community diversion program. The second are elderly residents of an affordable living center. And the third is a church-funded shelter for those experiencing housing insecurity. And I want us to think about what sort of skills, abilities, and leadership might be coming from their experiences, from their lives, what they may or may not know. Some of us may even have examples of this that are real world examples that we can struggle with. But I want us to think about what skills and abilities and gifts can be found from that, and what might keep us from thinking about it. And we'll take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. This is always a good question to ask myself as well. When I'm doing practitioning, is kind of looking at people who didn't catch my eye at first, when I'm coming into a community. And it's always a good practice to just think about those people and think about, and maybe in the next time I'm engaging, sort of just look to engage or look to listen a little bit more for people. This is especially the case with quiet people. I think quiet people get overlooked, no matter why you're quiet. And in one community leadership meeting, academy meeting, somebody said that, like, when people were talking about their skills, they said, my skill is supporting other people. And she didn't think there was much to it, but like we started asking about it and naming stuff, and like she was supporting, like her daughter was like trying to like get an art scholarship, and she had a friend who was working to get like 2 jobs, and she was like a part-time babysitter, and she was a shoulder to cry on. And I was like, man, that's it. I've had people who are like, they consider themselves problem children or something like that, but they're good at cutting attention in a room a lot of times, and that's a skill. And so just thinking about that, and I'm glad it sounds like a lot of people put a lot of thought into that, and we'll come back to these people a little bit later as we go through. But the next principle we talk about is recognizing the role of race and injustice and power. It's kind of what we were talking about before, that our history of racism can't be ignored, and our present circumstances of racism and social inequality can't be ignored. We have to find ways to bring that history and those experiences into our engagements. And it starts with, listening to and believing community members and validating those stories of inequality and discrimination and and marginalization. A lot of times, the default is like, let's keep that out of there. Let's find a way to nullify it. I just read a story about like somebody from the CDC who felt that the best way to talk about vaccines in Black communities was to completely skip over the history of medical apartheid in this country. And I just thought about how wild that was in 2022. But it's an organizing principle to sort of evade difficult conversations. And it turns out that most of the principles that we practices that we saw invited that difficult history in, and we learned together how to talk about that, how to discuss it, how to hear it, and how to be uncomfortable in those spaces together and make that part of our coming together. And so going back to these people, this is especially true if we're looking to, make use of the skills and abilities of people who are often left out in our society. We're not going to be able to do that if we're not going to like believe what their stories are. If we're going to say like, oh, well, maybe you caused that, or those are challenges for another time. If people can't be heard, they're not going to share their gifts with us. And so as facilitators, we have to first seek to find a way for people to be heard from their own circumstances. And then we can start asking about gifts. That's the least I think we owe to people who are already dealing with marginalization. Hospitality and listening is really about 2 things. Invitation is like, how are we inviting people into space? Are we inviting them for something relevant? And are we looking to be invited humbly into the ways that people are already engaging? That often we're told that, particularly in communities that are struggling with marginalization, that there's no engagement going on. There's always engagement going on, even if it's in somebody's living room. And if we want to know what the truth is to a community, we have to make ourselves invitable by sharing resources usually, but by coming to listen and listening first and actively listening, even when that listening is uncomfortable, and creating spaces where people can do both and belong. And so belongingness is a really big part of this. And Peter Block, once again, talks about associations, and we can bring this back to associations with de Tocqueville. Like, the power in associations first starts with getting people from a common walk of life together, but by bringing associations together, you can expand the way what people think of as community. And Peter Block talks about this, and John McKnight talks about this in The Abundant Community, is the power of associations, where people can come together in bigger groups and share more gifts and abilities, yes, but learn more about people who don't share our walks of life. While by starting off with people who do. So we can start off with people who share our ethnicity or our circumstances, and maybe by associating with others who may have similar ideals or goals, but coming from different walks of life, we ease ourselves into widening our circle and diversifying our circles, making it easier for us to diversify later. In America, we still remain very socially segregated along race specifically. By building associations on associations and widening that circle of the invited, we can, find ways to, move counter to that and start to build those associations. Trust building through commitment really asks us to think about what are the promises that we're making and keeping to communities, and then more importantly, how can we make our engagement process about elevators to empowerment? As we talked about before, engagement is not just about gathering, but it's about gathering to have a seat at the table. And a lot of times, that becomes sort of short shrift. We'll do that down the line in the engagement process. And, we found that it should be part of the process from day one if we're really serious about inclusion and equity. So how do we empower people not only at the end of a process, but even in our own meetings? How do we share the agenda? How do we, share the language? How do we, make space for people to talk about what they want to talk about? It's one thing if I want to come and talk about, housing inequity, but if people are like, we can't even keep the street lights on in our neighborhood, that's what we should talk about first. And we need to find a way to be flexible enough to do that. Honoring dissent and embracing protests is also, I'm going to talk a lot about Peter Block. Peter Block has this saying that was in one of his things where he talks about if people can't say no, then their yes is meaningless. And I remember reading that as a young researcher, and I had to quit work that day. It was late. But it still just struck me because I was like, yes, of course. We expect people to come to engagements willingly, to check off the box often in something that we think is good for them, but when they say no, we don't have any time for it. And usually it's not because we're bad people, it's because the way we've been taught to do engagement doesn't leave room for no, doesn't leave room for protest. And if it does, it's either mollifying protest or squashing it. And so the practices that we're talking about sort of take in that tension of protest, take in that tension of disagreement, and use curiosity about that disagreement to get us out of this yes-no dichotomy and think about is a different way that we can sort of embrace protest within our organizations and making that part of our civic engagement as we go forward. Adaptability to change is really just finding a way to practice all of these, all of the things that we've talked about so far. I'm sure some of the people who are already thinking of it, if you're in organizations thinking like, how are we going to do this? Because often when we're engaging, we're just the tip of a larger spear. If we're part of an organization or we're part of a nonprofit or if we're part of an institution like myself, being able to change engagement in this way is not just about changing ourselves, but also about talking internally about what needs to change in terms of funding, procurement, processes that are all sort of based off of an exclusionary ideal of engagement, even if people don't know it. It's really about having the ability for us and community members to take a look at how we need to grow and change in order to increase our equity over time. And that includes the ways that if we're doing everything right, the community becomes a more empowered partner in whatever we're doing, and how that changes things. Because even though we may have good intentions, things change a little bit when community members can say no and have some teeth to it. And so that may change the way we need to think. And so building in that time to reflect and change is an important bit about doing all of these things that we've talked about. So, just to kind of put a point on it, civic engagement is connected and nothing happens in a silo. When we talked about the fact that civic engagement is everywhere, and we talked about it as an environment, that's what it means, is that the people that we're inviting to engage here have also been engaging elsewhere. And so it's important to look beyond our own engagements and think, how are people being invited to engage elsewhere? And maybe we need to bring that up in our engagements too, if there's inequities involved that we need to talk about. Understanding that power disparities lend weight to assumptions that focus engagement structures for creating an equitable environment. Civic engagement is kind of created by those who have power to have engagement, and those power imbalances and disparities play a big part in how we are even invited to facilitate engagement. And we need to be very real about our space in those power imbalances, whether they be social inequalities or organizational inequalities, because community members can definitely see them. Principles lead us to questions that focus on solutions and targeted system inequalities. We talked about that before, about asking the right questions that get us to the right answers. One of the things that just really comes out is that we have to plan for it to begin with. We have to plan for creating these civic environments. It's not something that we can just sort of add into something that is inequitable. We have to be able to look at our assumptions and our strategies for civic engagement and, under the guise of these principles, these lenses, and say, is what we're doing leading to these success measures? Is it recognizing gifts? Is it recognizing injustice? Is it honoring dissent? Is it giving that power? And if it's not, then we need to have the courage to kind of start from the beginning and ask the right questions to build whole new processes. And it starts with effective and intentional planning for equity and inclusion. So why is it important? This is where we get back to this ideal of civic engagement and relevancy, right? Why is civic engagement not relevant? And we talked about a lot of the issues around that, about people feeling left out because of those inequalities, the changing nature of it. And I think it's important, this principled ideal of coming at civic engagement is important because now as practitioners, we are not just like carrying a forward momentum ball into our engagements. A lot of times, we may be the only place where anybody gets a chance to practice their civic identity or even come close to it. So in a lot of ways, we are responsible for creating a space, at least, for people to rediscover their civicness and civic identity and what that means, or just create it, because we're all creating it now. A lot of the rules that that led us here don't work anymore. And using a principled approach, we feel, is one of the ways in which you can kind of create that ground space for people to do it. And it really kind of goes back to the power of associations. I think the original power of associations, like we talked about, was that you could make a change by meeting together with people however it was relevant for you. And somehow we've lost that, largely because the people who need civic engagement to be relevant to them, people who have been left out socioeconomically, racially, in so many other different ways, aren't invited to spaces where they can create their own engagement and have that be powerful. And this kind of goes back to the hidden history of de Tocqueville and when he came. So what's not really mentioned a lot is that de Tocqueville didn't come to America alone. He came with a colleague of his, Gustave de Beaumont, this man right here, who's looking distinguished. And he was also a French politician and statesman and social reformer. And he was very interested not only in jails, but in slavery. He was an early proto-abolitionist. And, while de Tocqueville didn't want to talk about prisons because he wanted to talk about voluntary associations, Gustav wanted to talk about slavery, and he wanted to look at it. And they both produced these books. And Democracy in America was one of the books. And Gustav produced a book about slavery. I think it was called Marie, Story of a Slave. And it was basically sort of a sociological novel that talked about the ills of slavery and how Americans were treating indigenous people and removing indigenous people from their land and all of that. And both of these books were both celebrated, but only Democracy in America was taken up by Americans. Gustav's book didn't get printed in America until 1934. And even till now, most people don't know it, and it's hard to find an American print. And it really gets to what I think both of them really understood about America and voluntary associations. And they and de Tocqueville kind of spoke to this, is that the voluntary associations that America has is its lingua franca. It's how Americans talk to one another as citizens, and therefore it is how Americans can come together and solve complex social and economic problems. I think both of these men saw, this democracy is great, these voluntary associations are great, but slavery and Native American removal and all of these other ills. And, they didn't talk about voluntary associations as a celebratory way. They talked about it as America's most important working tool for solving complex social problems. That civic engagement isn't just something to do to celebrate people or just a tradition to have, that it has a purpose, and that purpose is to get people together to solve the problems that they have in common. And those problems should first and foremost be about the social inequalities and should highlight those in the middle, those who are in the challenge. That's why voluntary associations are powerful, because you don't have to be powerful to be involved in them. You can come from a powerless place. You can come with your life on fire to an association and work through associations with your neighbors who should care about you the most in order to provide solutions. And I think that's what people are looking for out of civic engagement, even now in this space, is a civic engagement that has that sort of magic to it, where 2 or 3 people who may not necessarily know each other can come together and understand one another, and through that alchemy, come up with policies that work with each other. So, that's what we're trying to create in today's sort of more cynical world about civic engagement, is creating a sense of what that process means for us today. Doesn't mean what it used to mean, and I'm here to tell you, I don't even know what it means right now. Civic engagement is unknowable, I think, to all of us, and I think that's the first leap that we have to go through. And the second leap is that what we need it to be, the road that we need to travel, is the road around inclusion and equity for engagement, in a space where everyone is included. And if we're walking down any other road, no matter why we're walking down it, we're not walking down the road that's going to get us back to that ideal of voluntary associations as a powerful place in America. And so I meant to do that while showing all those pictures, but just pretend that I did that. So I had another activity that was planned, but I'm like low on time. But we do have, so that activity was around a scenario. And we use these at Kirwan all the time, where we talk, we have a scenario that we've done in our time, and we'll have people come together and talk about where the principles are and aren't present, where equity is present and not present. I encourage you to do that on your own. It's not an assignment. It's just a way to think about these principles in a real world way. And if there's a chance for me to ever come back and talk about those, I would love to talk about that again. But what I really want us to get, just come through, is that when we are coming together as practitioners, our mission is no longer forwarding another mission. It's really creating engagement. As a matter of fact, we should all be excited. We are living in a time where we get to create civic engagement on our own terms, and on terms that are based around equity and inclusion, because that's what we care about. And so when we go into engagements and ask ourselves those questions first, we get to create that space, no matter how small it is, for people to be able to see themselves as civic-minded people, as civic people, as neighbors, in that same way. Once we start to create equity and inclusion, it gives people permission to create that for themselves and their neighbors. And so that's what I'm going to be trying to do myself over this next period of time, and I hope that you all will be as well, and I hope to kind of see you and work with you as we go out and do that together. I'll just end by giving a few spaces for further reading. Of course, Abundant Community is on there, Moving Diversity Forward, and my book, which is available through Kirwan's website, which is kind of janky sometimes, but here's also the link to it, just that you can go to yourself. So once again, I just wanted to thank everybody for letting me talk for 2 hours about my favorite subject, and I hope that everybody learned something from the awesome conversations that you had with one another. And thank you very much. Yes, I got minutes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have about
10 minutes, yeah.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes. Kip has to catch a flight.
Yes.
So he does have about 10 minutes for any questions or comments. So if you have questions, you can just use the mic here. I know there may be some questions from the...
Check. Okay, yeah. So you had talked about the ecosystem, right? With
Thank you.
the different aspects that would lead to greater civic engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to know some of the things in terms of socioeconomics, because you had talked about that and being that Venn diagram too. Yeah. And I was talking to my partner over here about how it could come into play, but wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, as well as the relevancy piece that prevents people from, as a challenge to civic engagement.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's like, what does that mean, like socioeconomic conditions? And I think you hit it on the head. Like the most important one, or the one that people think about a lot the most, is time and availability of skills and abilities. One of the things that I read in terms of research is that the poorer you are, the less opportunity you have. You're exposed to civic engagement when you're a child. Like if you're a child and you're living in middle class or upper middle class, one of your parents might have run for school board, or there's a whole study around the fact that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to know a politician on first name basis. Like this could be a relative for yours. So that a lot of times in America, that civic knowledge, since a lot of the formal ways of civic knowledge have kind of disappeared over the last 20 to 30 years, a lot of that happens informally through networks, and networks are highly segregated around race and class, and often networks that are populated by wealthier, whiter people tend to provide more opportunities, not only in business but also in gaining civic knowledge, knowledge of how to navigate the system, connections that will help empower you as well. So that's one way. Another way is the fact that poor people have less time. Poor people have less time to come to a meeting at 1 p.m. on a Wednesday. Poor people have to find a babysitter to come to a meeting later. If you don't have a car and it's not on a bus line, man, you can't go. All of those things play a part in how much power, and then just how much time. And then you add on to that a third thing is that most of the civic engagement language, I fell into it too probably here, is based around jargon that you would know if you were in a professional setting, or you may have learned in upper or middle class schools or life. And so really it goes beyond just the money, but what the money buys us. in terms of lifestyle, and then who is running the show and where they're coming from, usually from those upper middle class parts of life. And that's why, we talk about like being adaptable and changing, like, empowering people through the meeting and what that means for what we need to unlearn in that way if we're coming from a middle class kind of background like myself. That's a good question.
I have a question. So in one of your earlier slides, you mentioned Verna Myers as for further reading and resources. And one of my favorite quotes from her is, diversity is being invited to a party. Inclusion is being asked to dance, which I think is really just the crux of most of our lives. But can you talk about that in terms of sort of a challenge to like authentic civic engagement? Because we can invite everybody, people can all come, but that doesn't mean that they're going to have like any power or agency, right? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And I love that quote too. I'm like a huge Verna Myers fan for that reason. I think, it kind of goes back to what are we inviting people to? Often, civic engagement inadvertently usually are inviting people to, once again, environments where we're using language or what we call cultural indicators of power that are sort of familiar or based around sort of white middle class norms and ideals. It may not necessarily be relevant or readily understood by people who don't experience that a lot. And that's not a function of those people being dumb. It's like if you put any of us in a situation that is unfamiliar, we were probably more apt to be quiet. And so are we inviting people to dance a dance that they know or that they're familiar with or that's even relevant? If I'm inviting, once again, somebody to talk about income inequality, and I've got like me and a lot of other academic suits that are talking like on a conceptual level, and I'm somebody who's like, I need some help like right now, it's not going to be very relevant. But often, with good intentions, that's kind of what happens. That tends to be what gets funded a lot of times. And so we need to be very honest about that, about like, and sometimes, you can't invite people to the most relevant dance, but you can be very honest about what you're inviting them to, and so they can make those kind of decisions as well. But I think that plays a really big part of it. And then there's the opposite direction of like, instead of, trying to include, marginalized folks in our type of things, like how can we be included in a way that is relevant for them? A lot of times, especially I find myself, I work for Ohio State, so I work for an organization that has a lot of money. People invite Ohio State whether they would want to or not sometimes because we have the funds. And so being very cognizant of those power imbalances and saying, we want to be helpful, but we want to come how you need us to be. And you might have to say it 2 or 3 times because they probably won't believe it the first time. I wouldn't. But saying that and acting out on that, gives us a chance to be invited to their dance and learn new dances on our own as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you got to get ready to run, but
no.
You just mentioned something that got my mind thinking in terms of funding and what gets funded, right? So in thinking of equity and being adaptable and being inclusive, all these different things, any ideas in terms of how to still secure funding? Because funders want, good bullet points for reports type of thing, but then also how do you create the space? And it takes more time to do meaningful engagement, and funders usually go within that cycle type of thing. So any ideas around that?
Yeah, that is like the sort of the holy grail question a lot of times, and I don't know if I'll have a good answer for it. And yeah, my apologies. I wanted to make sure I wasn't rambling on and taking too much of anybody's question time, so that's the only reason I was looking at my thing. But yeah, I talk about this with organizations a lot because I think a lot of community-facing organizations and practitioners understand this need completely, right? They're like, you can't build long-standing relationships that are equitable and inclusive in like 1 or 2 meetings, dude. Like, you got to be there. And sometimes you're not going to be able to meet and check off a box. Sometimes you've just got to be there. But funders don't like to fund that, or traditionally haven't liked to fund that. And so a lot of times it comes to finding the right funders, having those right conversations, and having those kind of conversation with program managers right off the top, even really bringing up some of these points that are in the principles or something like that. And I think now might be the best time to really do that, because since the pandemic has come around, I think more foundations have become more acutely aware that they can't do the same types of engagements that they used to, nor can they expect anybody else to. You know, people are online, some people can't get online, the digital divide is a bigger ideal, and the pandemic and the protest 2020 just showed that a lot of people thought they were doing very good work in the community, and as it turns out, there was a lot of stuff they didn't know. And so I'm talking to program managers now, and it's easier to start that conversation about we need to fund civic engagement like separately, and it has to be a part of this effort in order to learn the things that we need to know to make the change that we have to make. And I usually like to couch it in that, like, we actually don't know. Our knowledge is important, but it's only part of the story if we're getting it from academic sources. That lived experience is clearly something we need to know in order to make this successful, because we don't want to come back here in 10 years ago and do it again. And so in order to stop that, we need to know, we need to have that on the ground relationship. I was in a conversation with a funder where we brought that up just recently, and I thought I was in for a fight, but they were like, yeah, that's kind of what we want to do too. So I think some of that is coming around, but I think, really having that relationship, building those relationships with program managers where you are upfront about like that's part of the success measures is probably the best way I can talk about it.
Hi, Kip. We have some questions from the chat, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
We have 2 questions from Civic Ambassador Antonia Edwards, and the first is, how do we motivate people in underserved communities, predominantly black and brown people?
Oof. I think, it kind of comes back to that, like, that earlier question is, what are we motivating them to do? And why? I think a lot of times, because this I get this a lot too, is like, a lot of, you kind of get a usual suspect sometimes when you're talking about minority communities or communities of color, and you can't get a lot of engagement for a lot of the problems that we talked about. Like sometimes people are struggling with like being able to get to a meeting. Some people feel like this isn't going to do anything. And so, a lot of times instead of motivating people to engage on my terms, I sort of like seek out where people are motivated to engage already. Because it's not that people don't want to engage, they just don't want to hear like a lot of like mumbo jumbo that's not going to lead anywhere. And so a lot of times I'm like, where can I listen to people? That might be at a meeting or a church or a barbershop or some other faith community. It could be at a festival. It could be just hanging out on a block in some places. But I think going where people are already motivated to go is a good way of maybe flipping that on its head. So we're not trying to do more and more and more work to get people to sort of wrangle people into an environment that they don't want to be in, but we can kind of find a way to be invited to these spaces, and that's the most important, is like finding ways to be invited and to listen is probably what I would suggest on that.
That's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. And our second question is, how much responsibility / accountability should be placed on leadership to meet people where they're at?
I mean, I would say, I guess I would say a predominant amount, because we're the ones who are engaging. I think, being a civic engagement ambassador or a civic engagement practitioner it's kind of like advanced citizenship, right? It's kind of like you're on the button, and certainly you can't be responsible for like making people do something they don't want to do. I mean, you can make yourself responsible for taking that extra effort to, become relevant or, practice these principles and things like that. But I do think that the onus is on me because, I want to create this space and I want to invite people in this space. And I know that I am operating now in a space that is very cynical and very sort of ambiguous about civic engagement and what it is and why it's relevant. And so, I especially nowadays, I think we're on the button for making a case for civic engagement in ways that we maybe hadn't been before. But that's okay, because a lot of the civic engagement practitioners that I see around this room and that I hear about really want to do as much as they can to engage a wider group of people and be inclusive. And I think that authenticity, when it's put into action enough times, will eventually create that motivation and create that sort of pull from the other side to be engaged.
Thank you so much.
I've got a couple more minutes if there was another one. And feel free to email me. My email is right there if you are like me and have questions later.
So thank you, Kip, for
Thanks. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for what you shared. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a safe trip.
I wish I could stay.
Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute bathroom break, and then we're going to do a quick plenary just to get a sense of what were some of the takeaways from the keynote and the activities. And we might be able to close, before 4:30, hopefully by 4:15. So 10 minutes, and then we'll be back for a plenary. Thank you. Okay, great. So this next plenary will be very, very short because, obviously we don't have a lot of people here. But I want to take this opportunity to ask, what were some of the takeaways? What were some of the lessons or best practices or concepts that Kip Holley shared with you that really stood out for you, that you can see yourself embracing and using in civic work in your communities? And feel free to use the mic there. Anything that comes to mind that was a takeaway for you. And also I want to invite the Zoom participants to share that in their chat room, and Jackie will be reading their remarks as well. So anyone, just feel free to approach the mic and share with us what were some of the things you gained, you takeaways that you had from this training by Kip Holley. That's the man, sagacity. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm the guy with the big mouth, right? So the one, and I brought this up when I asked the question too, is that the ecosystem is really going to stick with me, and also, just rethinking about, we invite people to go places, and like we want you to come to us type of thing, but thinking of how to create an ecosystem where it makes it easier for engagement. I think that's one of my big takeaways from today.
Absolutely. That's a good point, sagacity. And as you know, that's part of the work we do at Everyday Democracy, is create these spaces of voice for inclusive voice and all that. And I think that's important. People tend to forget that it's not all about themselves. It's about the people you're inviting to make sure that they are co-creators. They actually are co-creators of the civic engagement space, because that way they're invested in it, right? They're part of it, they're invested, and they take a more proactive role in it, and a leadership role sometimes if you're able to create those spaces. Yes.
So I have a couple pages of notes here, but I'll list one thing that kind of goes really good, is that community engagement is community empowerment, and that we live in a time where we get to create civic engagement on our own terms. I thought was really powerful in terms of it really doesn't have to be this lofty, unattainable thing for people. We can actually break it down to any sort of community group that we're a part of.
And that's a very powerful point. I agree. That was something that really was a takeaway for me, because oftentimes you go to a place and you sit there and you say, okay, I want to be engaged, and instead of you creating that opportunity to create an inclusive environment. One thing that I realized myself when I was meeting here with a small group is that we were creating an inclusive space because one of the attendees didn't speak English. And so I found myself translating, at the moment, and also and managing the conversation between the other two. Martha was one of them, and then Aisha Clark, who is the civic ambassador. Now, I wasn't planning on that, it just so happened. And so you have to be creative and you have to be willing to be adaptable. And that's one thing that he talked about being adaptable to change, and also to the engagement environment in which you're welcoming people, because you have to accept that they're coming from different places, different experiences. So you have to be adaptable and creative to make that space worthwhile for them. Otherwise they're going to feel like excluded, they're not valued, and so on. So that was a very powerful, for me as well, takeaway. Yeah. Elizabeth.
I'm just going to add to what I think Patrick. Yes, what Patrick just mentioned. I think, civic engagement doesn't have to be formally organized, right? These are conversations that happen like port steps in, front of your building and in parks. I mean, so it doesn't need like a facilitator and a presenter. It doesn't need all of that. It just needs people coming together around a shared concern and value.
Absolutely. It's relational. I'm glad you said that, Elizabeth, that civic engagement really should be about relationships to start with, not just the activity, right? Build relationship. One thing I'll say, for example, Richard, I've known Richard for many, many years, and we built a friendship. And out of that friendship, we've done some great work, civic work together. And in large part, it has to do with that affinity and friendship that we have. I'm sure the same thing for all of you, that you've built friendship with people that you started doing some civic work together, and then you build friendship out of that. And that's long-standing. That goes on for many, many years. How long has it been, Richard? Like what, 10 years at least?
Too long to remember.
That's right, absolutely. Jackie, I think some Zoom participants are probably sharing, right?
Yes, yeah. Laura would like me to share that I learned that regardless of the challenges we all face, we must continue to fight for inclusion and encourage all voters to engage and participate by voting and speaking up. We must all be braver and not get discouraged. Easy to say, hard to do, but we all must try.
That's right. That's so important, especially now, because we know that there's a lot of movement nationally to disenfranchise people, and it has taken collective work, collective power, organizing to challenge these kinds of, voter suppression efforts, for example. It happens in the courts, so we know that. The courts are the place of recourse, but it starts with individual people coming together and challenging these kinds of exclusive voting practices. So again, civic engagement may take many forms. It may end up in public policy, in the courts, in litigation, but it starts with people. It starts with people coming together and saying, we can't let that stand. And then they bring lawyers, or they bring out policy experts, and together then they bring about change. But it starts with individuals. Yeah, absolutely. Richard, yeah.
Is this mic on?
Sure. I think you should be on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. By the way, I think it's more like 15 years, Val.
You're right. You're probably right.
I think so.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I liked Kip's 6 principles for civic engagement, and we could talk about all of them. But the very first one strikes a chord for me: embracing the gifts of diversity. What I've learned, what we've all learned doing this kind of work, is that everybody has gifts. Everybody has something to bring to the table. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Who you are, or where you're from, or what you're wearing. I do work here in Hartford with police officers and neighborhood residents together, and that's one of the ground rules at the beginning. Mm-hmm. One of the norms, group norms, is everybody's voice is equal. It doesn't matter who you are, what you're wearing. Everybody has a gift. Everybody has something to bring.
Absolutely. So. Thank you, Richard. I like that activity that we did, because in the table there we talked about young people and the elderly. And Aisha, who is one of the civic ambassadors, she had to leave, but she was sharing with me and Martha and another civic ambassador about the work that, with the elderly, and how elderly people tend to be very quiet and reserved, but they have a lot of wisdom. They have the gift of wisdom and experience, and they have had a life to really negotiate different kinds of things, and many of them over the course of many years have learned to be more accepting and welcoming and open, so they can contribute to a culture of openness and inclusiveness if only people were able to engage them comfortably. So gifts of diversity is so important. Absolutely, yeah. Jackie, anything else? No? Okay. Oh, okay.
From Mary Young. As a community organization, this presentation is a great tool for a retreat in looking at our organization's impact on the community and what we need to do and where we need to incorporate some revisioning as we have lost some key volunteers. The principles given will guide us to ensure we are meeting the community need and ensuring they make available a place which the community feels comfortable and safe to voice their opinions and concerns themselves.
Wow, that's a great takeaway. That's a great takeaway, and it speaks to what Kip was talking about, that we have to be intentional about applying these principles, and the approach, right? He talked about the approach to civic engagement as being the initial point, not to do it midway in the process of a civic engagement project, but from the very beginning thinking about the approach. How do we approach it? How do we bring the gifts of diversity? How do we bring adaptability? How do we bring all these principles and apply them as we continue this engagement process from the very beginning? So I thought that was good, and that was a great takeaway. All right, wonderful. So I'm going to close now. For everyone in the Zoom room that has attended, and all of you, thank you so much. Remember that tomorrow we have the second part of the summit, day 2, which is going to be virtual on Zoom. And those of you, we sent an email this morning. Please check your mailbox, because there is a link there for Zoom for you to register in Zoom, and then you'll get a Zoom link. You'll get your unique Zoom link. Once you click that, then you'll be able to access the day 2 of the summit. And that will start, I think at 12:30 is when we'll start welcoming people, and then at 12:45 I'll be doing welcoming remarks. We're going to have a great panel. Elizabeth Joseph, who is here with us today, is going to be one of the panelists, and she's going to talk about how important it is to, when we're doing this civic work, to examine our own biases, right, and our own, tendencies and mindsets that we bring with us. Like sometimes we bring that as old baggage, into civic work, and that old baggage ends up playing itself out. And sometimes we're not even aware of it. We're not even conscious of it. So we have to be intentional to check ourselves. And organizations need to reflect on that themselves. Everyone in the whole experience of civic engagement, they need to check themselves to see, where am I being biased? Where can I be a little bit more open about different people being part of this work? So those are some of the things that Lisa will talk about. We'll also have Antonia. Antonia Edwards was in the Zoom meeting. She asked a great question earlier today, and she's going to talk about public policy advocacy. She's been doing some amazing work with state legislators, working on declaring racism a health crisis, and also legislation around mental health. So she's going to talk about how public policy can create spaces and opportunity, inclusive spaces for people, everyday people, not just public policy professional advocates, but individuals like her, to work with legislators and with policymakers to bring about change at the policy level, which is going to be a great conversation. And then we're going to have also Steve Armstrong, who is the social studies consultant with the Connecticut Department of Education, and he's going to be bringing a student from Norwich Free Academy, and they're going to talk about civics learning and how important it is for civics education to create the kinds of skills and knowledge and mindsets and understanding of civic engagement to be able to enable youth to have a place in civic engagement and to be able to express themselves through that process of engagement. And they're going to talk about the Red, White, and Blue Schools, which is a project that is providing those kinds of opportunities and spaces for young people to learn. And also we're going to get to meet the Connecticut Kid Governor. right? I bet you, most of you probably don't know, there is someone called Kid Governor in Connecticut. His name is McCoy Etienne Modeste, and he was elected in November. He's a 5th grader, and he ran a campaign. He's running a campaign engaging 5th graders all over the state in a campaign against cruelty to animals. And of course, young people care about animals. And that's an example of how you engage people where they are, right? Where do kids, what are the things that kids care about? Animals, obviously. And they get engaged in something that they care about. So that's an example of a very young civic ambassador, Mackay, who is going to talk about his campaign, and we're going to have a short video to share as well. Again, I want to thank all of you, because I know taking a whole day, a whole afternoon is something that, you know, it takes commitment. So I want to thank all of you, those in Zoom and those of you who are here. And also want to thank everyone. I want to thank Stan. Thank you, Stan, for making this possible. The hybrid experience is new to us, and he's a professional, really. I mean, he's amazing. So thank you, Stan, for that. I want to thank Liz as well and her staff for allowing us to use the space and supporting us here. I want to thank Jackie, who has been fantastic, supporting me through these months. And also want to thank Agnes and Jennifer and Naisha, who helped us with the marketing and all that for the summit. And so want to thank the planning team and the sponsors that I mentioned earlier. Tomorrow, again, we're going to start at 12:30 on Zoom. Please make sure you check your email and click on the registration link, so that way you'll get the access link from Zoom. Okay. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay. Thank you.